live? Yes, now we are live. Hello, sorry for the delay. Thank you for those who have stuck with us through the 1 or 2 minutes of taking care of some technical difficulties as they happen. Zoom life is, quite frankly, probably the only life that we have right now. But I'm gonna introduce our lovely and fabulous and brilliant participants, but I first want to just say good evening, Augustonians, and welcome everybody into the digital space. This is our monthly programming, Lit Fridays. If you are new to the program, this is a program we do on the final Friday of every month where we talk to critical thinkers, philosophers, poets, and artists, put them in conversation with one another. And sometimes we have people come in to read on their own. And so for Latinx Heritage Month, we are going to be welcoming Bernardina Baristo at the end of October. We're gonna have 2 events who won the Man Booker Prize. And we're also going to be inviting Maricel Vera, who wrote The Taste of Sugar, who's gonna be with us on October 16th, I believe. So make sure that you stay connected to our website and our social media so you know that those events are coming up. There are gonna be 2, and we'd love to have you visit with us. In light of recent news about the Breonna Taylor verdict for the police officers who murdered her, I want to just reaffirm the inherent value of Black women, no matter their experience or walk of life. This is very important for us to remember right now because our most critical movement for abolition and liberation is the Black Lives Matter movement that is represented by and was founded by queer Black women. And it is important for us to always keep that in the forefront of our mind, the affective and communal labor that comes from Black women and making sure that our communities remain afloat and that we're all taken care of and that we all have a greater and better understanding of who we are and how we move forward. I also want to encourage everybody to vote. Anyone who knows me personally knows that that's something very surprising to hear me say, especially, but bipartisan politics cannot be the only way that we determine the value of human life in this context. We have to step outside of those kinds of dichotomies, and we have to make decisions that are going to put the value of human life first. And it's important regardless of voter fraud that we're concerned about, racially predicated felony convictions that destroy our voting opportunities in our community, and housing instability that causes resident status to be greatly affected, that also impacts votership, for us to still be a part of having other people be encouraged to vote. If you can't vote, protest. If you cannot protest, support and care for a Black woman, and find a way to be present while also finding a way to continue healing in this moment where we are continually being shown by our government that we are not valued as people who have explicitly contributed to the greatness of the country that actually exists, as opposed to a fantasy of a great country. The actual country that is great is the one that we built. And so I want to just have everyone close their eyes with me and take a collective breath for Breonna. So we'll start now. And exhale. It's important for us to take our breaths because they are not often given to us, or we are not allowed to remain with our breaths. And now I want to thank Mikael and Jari for joining me. And then I want to turn to Joy because they're here. They're here with us. They have wonderful things to share and say. Jari is a Black genderqueer poet and scholar from San Francisco, California. They have received fellowships from Callaloo, Cave Canem, and Tin House. Their work has been nominated for Best of the Net by The Offing and was a finalist for Columbia Journal's Fall 2019 contest in poetry. Jari's work has been published in the Adroit Journal, The Offing, the Academy of American Poets, Callaloo, Columbia Journal, the Virginia Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. Jari Bradley, who received their MFA from the University of Pittsburgh, is the current 2020-2021 First Wave Poetry Fellow at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. And on October 2nd, Jari is going to be doing an Instagram live takeover discussing their work. The handle for this is at ROMC Library, and that event's going to take place on October 2nd from 4 to 5 Pacific Standard Time. We're going to be posting these events on our Facebook after the event is over, so that way everyone can follow them on Instagram, keep up with their career, keep up with how they're progressing and sharing themselves in the world. And Jari will also be hosting the first wave open mic series called Just Bus. Something else that Jari is doing is that they have a craft intensive coming up with Tin House on October 24th. That link will also be shared so everybody can register and get their learning together about poetry. The next speaker is Mikael Owunna, is a Nigerian Swedish-American photographer, Fulbright scholar, and engineer. His work explores the relationship between engineering, optics, the Black body, and queerness. Owunna imagines new universes and realities for marginalized communities around the globe. Owunna's work has exhibited across Asia, Europe, and North America, and has been featured in media ranging from the New York Times, CNN, NPR, and Vice to The Guardian. He has spoken and lectured about his work at venues from Harvard Law School to World Press Photo in the Netherlands and Sveriges Radio in Sweden. His first published monograph, Limitless Africans, was released in 2019. Owunna will be featured in a streamed event for the Tate Modern from November 5th to November 12th, in conjunction with the launch of South African photographer Zanele Mohole's survey exhibition. And Jari is going to start us off with sharing some work, and then Mikael will follow up with a short presentation, and then I will get into my questions and into their business.
All right. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored. So without further ado, this first poem is called Dysphoria. I say, boy, not sure if I mean myself or an undoing, a slippage of sex, but always meaning a tender violence or child's play, a way of becoming. I say boy and mean a small god of making, an appraisal of my bad shape, its favor of the blood that does and does not come. Dysphoria is what it is called when I say I don't care for my breasts, or is what I mean by they get in the way. I say men and mean hunger or twin tongue, a kin taste for cruelty, stalled at the sight of the first wound. I say heal and mean to keep the dogged fear at bay as its hands tear into my hefty frame, persistent until I feel a pit opening inside me. I say girl and mean Lord, have mercy on those days where I didn't deserve any of it. Have mercy on how weak I believed I was. The body's question after Tracy K. Smith was a question of my nature. Why no blood at the start? I was no good at girlhood or submit, though I did surrender to the animality of adolescence. So much hair and sweat in the wrong places. The humility in all that unknowing proved I could be a thing of my own making. To exist as what had yet to be named meant wearing sir and finding I could keep a secret that I could refuse an answer. Transmogrification. I emerged from the eye of a man's hunger, quadrupedal and measured, self untethered from the self. I have no memory of the happening, only a wilderness, a wildness struck in my blood. I am a child gone feral in the night of a man's primal urge, violation, its black expanse star mapped, constellation of a man's bruising. Is this the site of metamorphosis? What turned myself outside myself? And this is the last poem, Interior. I stroll the body's wilderness, those last truly wild places, an attempt to wrest joy from its hiding place, the body's expanse, its granular pleasures, its strict reserves, undisturbed, its flora, its fauna. This is how I live with what has been done in the dark. Something inside me grows lips against the body's intolerable ravine, its treacherous gulches, an impossible sorrow surely meant to drown me. Something within reaches toward the natural light, a wild phenomena, its act of witness, an untethering in the body's closed quarters, its wild notes, a defiance, a disobedience. What I mean is, joy is a wild thing, rendered in the wilderness of my blood when loosed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jari. I encourage everyone to just go on Google and type in Jari Bradley and read everything that they can and get access to it as soon as this is over. But now that we have them here with us, that's sufficient for now. But Mikael, are you ready?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm going to present two bodies of work from my series Limitless Africans and Infinite Essence. So I'm going to show a few images, and it's really just a pleasure to be here, particularly because Jari and I are both in conversation around Black queerness and what can Black queerness mean? What can that look like within this moment? I think right now we are in such a pivotal time. And so I think particularly centering Black queerness and Black queer identities is so, so important. And so, I think I just really invite all of the listeners to just really, soak in the knowledge that's going to be shared here today, and like kind of just listen, and I hope that you all enjoy too. So I'm going to share just a few images. So I'm going to, the Zoom can sometimes be a little confusing. So let's see if it's going to work. Okay. Okay. So this is an image from my series, Limitless Africans. And so this is my first really major body of work that I did. And I photographed this series over 10 years, over 6 years. And I photographed it in 10 different countries across North America, Europe, and the Caribbean. And I was really interested in what does a Black queer experience look like across borders, right? And so I was particularly struck by my own experience growing up being queer and Nigerian and struggling with that tension of being told that this is not of our culture, right? And going on this journey was so important for me to also connect us back to African histories of gender and sexuality, and then bringing us into the contemporary context to examine them with queer and trans African people living today. And so this is an image of a mem who is queer Nigerian and identifies as agender. And so one of the things that was really interesting here was for all of the images, I invited the models to pick clothing and objects which for them made them feel really affirmed in who they were. And so typically, I'd never seen an image of another LGBTQ African person until I was 23 years old when I saw the work of Snelly Maholi. And so I was really struck by that quote unquote lack of representation, but more so interested in thinking about the ways in which I could use photography as a space to transform and create these new representations for our community. And so inviting the models in to actually pick their clothing, pick the locations. And so this is a collaboration I did with the MEM and is a part of that larger series. And so I also included this image here because in my current body of work that I'm shooting, Infinite Essence, there's overlap actually between some of the models in both bodies of work. So you can see also my own development as a photographer and how I also introduced in engineering into my practice too. So this is the photograph of a mem in the Limitless African series. And this is the photograph of a mem from my series, Infinite Essence. And so for Infinite Essence, I mean, I think people tell me it's very prescient right now, and I think it's always been really, really relevant. But I was really struck in 2014 by the murder of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri, shot and killed by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. I think it's Darren Wilson, correct? And so I was thinking of when I saw one of the things that struck me first is that, the public lynching and his body just being left in the street for hours, and then also after that, the media then publicized the image of his body across the world without the consent of his family. And I started seeing again and again on repeat this image of Black people being shot and killed, or bodies washing up on the shores of the Mediterranean, starving in award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning photography on the continent, and just this motif of the Black body as a site of death. And so I wanted to think about the ways in which I could use photography and combine my engineering skills in a way that could transfigure the Black body from being a site of death and state violence to being the site of these eternal cosmic vessels, and so redefining, kind of realigning us with Blackness as being a divine cosmic principle of the universe. And we see this within our African indigenous practices, this really rich generative space in which Blackness is the origin of life, it's the origin of existence. And so to do that, what I did with these images, and I'm going to show a short clip afterwards, is that I actually built my own flash that only transmits ultraviolet light. And then I hand paint the model's bodies with fluorescent paint. So all of the colors you see here are actually paints on the model's body, MM's body. And then in total darkness, I click down on the shutter, and then for a fraction of a second, the light emits and illuminates their bodies with these patterns of the cosmos. Again, trying to bring out this space of Blackness as this divine cosmic principle. So I'm going to show a quick short clip so all you can see the actual process. I'm going to mute it. But there I am with my camera. The model's body is already painted, but the paints aren't visible to the human eye. So it's like, there's going to be a effect you're going to see called ultraviolet fluorescence. So then the flash emits and then illuminates them for a fraction of a second. So I'll show it one last time so y'all can see the effect. And like that, you go from this plane, the visible plane, to this one. This is the same model, Sam, just illuminated with ultraviolet light. And so I think about the ways in which, that emergence from the Blackness of the space. The model emerges from the Blackness of the space, and then we capture that for a fraction of a second with using using the camera. And so with all my work, I'm trying to think about the ways in which we can realign ourselves with this larger cosmic principles of Blackness. And within that, there's all these other themes of queerness being really central, androgyny being really central. And so I think within this moment, I really invite everybody to kind of be thinking about our African mythologies and kind of these larger stretches of time in which we can define and redefine what it means to be Black, queer, and a human being at this moment.
Thank you so much, Mikael, for bringing all of that to the forefront. And this is a really important conversation at the moment. In my experience over the last 5 to 6 years, the fissures I see within our communities have been principally around losing brilliance, losing people who could be preservations to our communities because of religious conservatism within our communities, and sometimes cultural conservatism around gender and gender queerness and different representations of Black sexuality within our world. And it's important for us to be as open, as you said, to these mythologies that are more centered on role than gender, to these mythologies that give us opportunities to imagine beyond the brutalistic context that's been created for us, and that we replicate in an effort to survive sometimes. So thank you for sharing that. My first question is related to perception. And it's in both of your works, Mikael and Jari, in your poetry. You both speak from this meeting place of exterior perception and a positionality of self-knowing. And as you negotiate this interaction between an exterior perception and a reality of self-knowing, there's also negotiation around the value of life when it, to an exterior perception, is somewhat unintelligible and therefore unpredictable. Can you speak about that in each of you speak about that in your work?
I mean, Jari, do you want to go first? I know that particularly in dysphoria, but I mean, I think across your poetry, I think it's really central.
Yeah, I definitely can. I think for me, my experience as a Black genderqueer person has always been very body centric, right? And so, living day to day, is always, an encounter with the ways in which like the body so much is centered around, just perception and how misperception seems to rule, right? Like, so oftentimes, there are times where I will be, or I have been in situations, right, where I've been misgendered or so forth and so on. And so that experience, along with like, this idea around Blackness and Black gender queerness has fused itself into my work because so much of that perception, lends itself to the ways in which my body is situated and treated. My body is configured within, a kind of collective social consciousness, right? And that is something that on a day-to-day basis I'm having to confront, right? And so much of that in that consideration, I think, goes hand in hand with, the ways that we're talking about, Black embodiment, Black being, as this push against the ways in which, like, you have these historical, connotations or concepts around what Blackness is, from a very visual, very phenotypic kind of standpoint, the ways in which that has been determined, defined, and so much of my body has been defined for me that, my work really is centered around, how to tell an alternative story, give an alternative narrative, but also for my body to speak for itself in many ways that often I never get a chance to do. The work tends to try to dismantle some of these held and fixed notions of, my body, but also Black bodies, Black genderqueer bodies, as ones of value as opposed to ones of abnormality. And that is in direct connection, I think, with the ways in which, this society, this country is trying to deal with this so-called Black problem, right? This historical kind of issue of the color line, right? Where Black has historically been signified and dignified as other, as abnormal, as abject, right? And that, for many folks, that kind of historical overview of Blackness, that kind of description, many folks don't have the context, but, the way that Blackness has been defined has been, not just about, the phenotypic kind of racial thing, but it's also about being, it's a conversation about gender as well, right? So those two things, race and gender, for me were very integral at a time where I was trying to figure out myself, trying to figure out, where my place was in the movement, in the discussion of Black lives, right? I've always been very adamant in my work about, my folks, Blackness, this country, the treatment, the history. But, there's also a very real, I won't say a conundrum, but there's a very real issue in that some of my folks wouldn't even consider me to be Black enough, right, to say the things that I say or to stand for the things that I stand for because I'm a Black queer person, right? And in some queer spaces, I'm not queer enough because I'm a Black queer person. I am, so some of those politics don't always align, right? So there's this very strange in-between space that I think Black queer folks find themselves in that lend themselves to this like larger conversation about race and gender simultaneously that my work tries to get at. And that absolutely has everything to do with like these outer perceptions and trying to dismantle them. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that was really interesting when Jari and I were talking was like, we also looked at one of the images that I had of a mem up there. So maybe I can just screen share it like briefly back so people can see it just for context. But one of the things that's been really fascinating in terms of this image is that the gendering of the image. And so people will look at the image and will be like, oh, he looks great. Or people will be like, oh, like is that a boy? Is that a girl? Da, 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 da. And it's, I mean, and MM was assigned female at birth and identifies as agender and uses she, her, and they, them pronouns. And so the actual perception of the body, becomes ambiguous. And I think that actually really speaks to like these larger ways in which within like African traditions, gender was seen in a more vibratory way. And so Malidoma Somé talks about this concept of gatekeepers. And so Black queer, or now we would kind of maybe determine, like say, LGBTQ people being the gatekeepers, spiritual gatekeepers of their communities, the ones who would manage the portals between the spiritual world and the physical world. And within that frame, they were Black queer and LGBTQ people were seen as, because of having masculine and feminine energies and vibrations, we were seen as being closer to the creator. Because the creator, so if we think about, for example, the Dogon creator god Amma, within the translated French text is described as he, but then has a womb, a placenta, the world emerges from Amma's womb. And so there's a space of primordial androgyny that you really see there. And so, with being kind of having this combination of energies, Black LGBTQ people were the ones who were seen as closer to the creator. And so I think actually in terms of seeing this image and thinking about the image and the perception, right, in terms of the modern context, but also understanding the depth and complexity in which perceptions historically from a Black context have come from, how generative Blackness has been in terms of actually understanding, gender, right, in a much more complex way. I feel like that is such a rich space of exploration that people now are kind of like, oh, what's this or that? And I'm like, Black people have been doing this for thousands of years. And so I find that just to be so fascinating, kind of thinking about the modern ambiguity of an image like this one of MM, but while thinking about that primordial androgyny, which is really in several of these African cosmological traditions.
Right. And then have even been with us through the Middle Passage, right? So if you think about the existence of candomblé as a version of regla ocha in Cuba, candomblé in Brazil, regla ocha in Cuba, and then you're thinking about Yoruba spiritual traditions that are in, Southeast Benin, some places in Togo, and then Southwest Nigeria. When we think of figures like Olokun, has always been androgynous and remained androgynous in their manifestation from the bottom of the ocean, primordial, placental, but still androgynous in the Americas. Or we think of figures like Oya, also known as Yansa, who, while in some versions of oral traditions constructed as the mother of Egungun or ancestors or the dead, also switches places with Shango, who is like a symbol of like masculine virility. But then there are times where they actually go to war together to confuse people. And so us having an actually historicity attached to those traditions that you're talking about is really important, because so much of it through all of the history that we're still taught in these schools or in institutions is ahistoric. It is incorrect and purposefully misinterpreted. And so we don't really have examples for how to address one another based on an inherent value of life, regardless of gender, while also acknowledging those experiences. We're still rebuilding that. And also, just for references for anyone who's willing to learn or wanting to read more, Roderick Ferguson's Aberrations in Black is a wonderful resource for understanding the history of race and gender in the African American community, in the United States in particular. And another resource is Riley C. Snorton's Black on Both Sides, which does Caribbean, Global South, as well as American analyses of gender in the 18th, 19th, and partially 20th century. It's also a wonderful resource if you're looking to read more and gather a wider understanding. And so now that we're talking about perception and the gaze, do either of you ever think about the gaze when you're in the heat of making your work? And if you're thinking of the gaze, then whose gaze are you thinking about? Or is it just panopticonic is there just this surveilling eye that's placed in the center of us as Black people that is constantly concerned?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Jari,
that's an interesting question, because I think it's both and sometimes. I think it varies. I think when I am sitting down to create work, I have, and this is me personally, but I have already been wrestling in my mind, right, about or with, you know, the issue and the condition of being surveilled. That is a constant presence in my work, and in my life, and so when I sit down to do the work, um, I'm really, in this kind of mindset of dissecting, right? At the core, how have we as a society come to establish who is deemed human and who is not deemed human, how those definitions have come to be. And that involves a lot of the outside perception again, and especially in consideration of, human, since the Enlightenment period and so on, being defined as a white cisgendered man, right? That for many Black folks, for many Africans, um, our literal bodies were never considered a part of that equation or that definition, that we were automatically X'd out of that definition. That's always the energy that I sit with when I'm creating. And that is always kind of, at the forefront of my mind, when I am thinking about how to give language to that phenomena, to give language to that paradox, that injustice, because it really, so much of that, is the basis for why, we are having to chant the things that we are having to chant. So much of that is the basis for why we are killed, with, reckless abandon. There is no consequence for our bodies because this historical definition, these decisions, right, have been made on the part of our bodies not being human, right, not being considered a part of the human family, that we are not, actual beings, people worthy of being seen as valuable. So we are very disposable, from the gate. And so, yeah, that is always something that I'm wrestling with in my work.
yeah, I think for me, like it's been a shift and a journey also, because when I began as a photographer, it was really struggling with the tension between queerness and Blackness, queerness and Africanness. And so feeling like those two were not compatible identities. And then kind of going on a journey to try to like, dealing with that gaze externally on myself and trying to wrestle with that, while I was kind of doing that work, when I started reading the historical sources around actually pre-colonial African sexuality and gender, this concept of the idea of LGBT, quote unquote, LGBTQ people in historical context, different terms, right? But being the gatekeepers for our communities, being really elevated spiritual roles and healers, that started shifting my idea around what the gaze represents and what it means, right? And so one of the things actually just recently I was reading was actually within the Dogon spiritual system, when Amma, the creator god, created the universe, they opened their eyes. And so like this is a primordial androgynous figure, like opening their eyes and the universe coming into being. And so for me, the idea of that surveying eye, right? When I displace it from being this surveying eye of whiteness, the surveying eye of white supremacy, to being the surveying eye of Amma, our creator god, our primordial androgynous creator god, that coming into my work has started to shift and evolve my practice to, I think, also thinking about the ways in which making the work has also opened my eyes to the limitless possibilities that exist within Blackness. And I think that also makes me hope that simultaneously also that work can also do that for other people too, to open their eyes, and in that act revive that kind of primal act of Amma, the creator god, who opened their eyes and created the universe.
Thank you. So, Jari, I also think of your poems as two-way mirrors. And I want to know about the agency and the X-ray. Your speakers have this X-ray ability through determining very intimate things about people's reactions to them. And this is very agential for me. This is a form of agency. Can you talk more about that two-way mirror gaze of your speakers and the agency in that?
Sure. Yeah, I think some of it is a little, I wouldn't say it's unconscious, but some of it is a little hard to language. But I think my experiences as a child really kind of set the foundation for how I envision or think through my speakers. So, as a child, being fat, Black, dark skinned, I was often made to be invisible and very small in certain spaces, right? I was made to shrink. And I think that, just growing up, I had a lot of experiences where people had opinions about my body or just me in general, because of that kind of intersectionality, those kind of intersections. And what happens is that you become very privy to the things that are said about you, right? You become very privy to the way people outwardly feel about your being, your very presence, right? And as a child, I wanted nothing more than to please people. But you grow up, you get older, and you learn what that really all of that really is about. And so those speakers for me, they are very quiet in that they are observers. So a lot of the voice and the kind of mind work that happens through these speakers comes by way of them being very observational, and being very in tune to their environments because they've had to be. Because these speakers have often been in situations of danger, right? So being a queer child, being a Black queer child, you are often in situations of danger, which means you have to have a very heightened sense of awareness about what is happening around you. I was a child that was embedded within a lot of violence. And so, you have to read, your environment in order to know what situations you're in, to adequately be able to respond. And so often, I think Black queer children in particular are made to have to do those types of things. But also, in our adulthood, we are having to be made to be privy to, the outward comments that are made when we simply are walking down the street, right? Those types of things. We are always in the presence of danger. Unfortunately, right? That at any moment in time, those things can happen. And to be a Black queer person, you could be getting it from all sides, right? So those speakers are, really penetrating into kind of, these outward thoughts, notions, and feelings of their bodies, as these things are being said in front of them, or they've heard whispers or things of that nature, because they've had to be very keen and get close to those types or that way of knowing a person. But also they know intimately themselves. They know intimately, what their intentions are. That whole pleasing principle, wanting to be accepted. I think as a child, I knew I was smart, but because of my intersections and so forth, people had judgments, right? So as a poet, I'm able to kind of re-articulate and give language to, I think, the interiority of a Black queer childhood, of a Black queer embodied existence, which is to say that, we have more to offer, that there's a lot more behind what you're seeing. And that so much of us go silent, or we are rendered silent because, so much of that outwardly, those projected kind of observations are so loud, right? But rarely do we get to hear from the Black queer child. Rarely do the speakers that I create, that I write, rarely do they get to speak for themselves. And so I think it really is about getting to hear a Black queer child speak for themselves, which is so, it's It's funny because it's simple, but yet radical, right? How often are we listening to Black queer children, to Black queer people speaking in their own voices for themselves, of their own autonomy, of their own being?
Thank you. And Mikael, so when I was kind of like going through all of the work of yours I could find, I was thinking about the trajectory of your photography in relation to people like James Van Der Zee, photographers of that time who, as a matter of survival, were really trying to attend to a mimesis of showing Black people as able to arise to white expectations via like Du Boisian ideations of uplift, you know, eschewing all of the very eugenic, inaccurate, and racist modalities of framing Blackness as being hypersexual, dangerous, impoverished, and uneducated. And then thinking about how your work as a photographer deals with transnationally Black and queer subject matter and is in conversation with Zanele Mohole or Deanna Lawson, people who are not interested in the respectability politics that we had to attend to at the turn of the 20th century and a little bit before, and even to this day. There's this long conversation we're having as a transnational Black community that seems to be getting louder now around this idea of respectability politics. What does it mean when it comes to gender and sexuality, and how the new generation of people who are framing our culture globally is going to deal with that? Could you talk about your work in regard to that interaction, that long arc of a conversation?
Yeah, so I think definitely definitely in the early 20th century, you saw this larger narratives around, the more in which we can ascribe ourselves to white ideals of quote unquote excellence, right? And we see that embedded within these larger conversations around what does Black excellence mean, right? But that's kind of, it's still within this like white supremacist frame of understanding of, okay, if we frame, and Frederick Douglass talked about the relationship with the image and Black body, and I trying to show Black people as being, adequate, intelligent, etc. One of the things also I think that tension that comes into Van Der Zee's work that I think doesn't really get brought up around why that representation maybe looks the way it does is because he was a commercial photographer. So his audience was also geared towards a kind of a Black middle class primarily audience, and what were they looking for? And so I think that also speaks to a larger cultural moment that's been ongoing, and we still see it today. And so I think, as you're mentioning, we have Zanele Mohole, Deanna Lawson, there's this whole generation of photographers now that are really tackling these notions of like queerness, gender, in a much more way that kind of just says, well, I don't need to be respectable in the way in which you see me in order for my body to have value, for me to have value. And I feel also like a lot of resonance with that into the way in which my work has shifted towards kind of moving beyond just this idea of what can make my work, what can make the figures look valuable to white people, right? Oh, they're wearing a suit, or they're doing this, or some type of really respectable idea of uplift, and instead shifting it to be thinking about these larger timescales and mythologies and these indigenous Black ideas around what Blackness represents. And so rather than shifting it to be, oh, we need to do these type of things to, move ourselves ahead, being like, well, what if we just almost literally disintegrate into kind of this pool of Blackness, in this really expansive way in which our ancestors have been describing. And so for me, that's really been a core of the shift. And I think there is, as you were mentioning, I think now there are more and more people working within this mode of thinking and kind of shifting the way in which we want to visualize what a emancipatory Black image, Black body looks like, right? It doesn't have to look like a Black man in a suit. A Black man doesn't have to be in a suit to be valuable. A Black woman doesn't have to be, a certain type of respectability in order for her body to have any value. Black queer people don't have to necessarily ascribe to certain gendered notions of how we should maybe dress and talk and move in order for us to have any value. Our ancestors have always had this really expansive notion of Blackness. And so I really encourage kind of that movement that we're starting to see. Yeah.
And so I want to circle back to the like opening kind of energy that we had. You know, what we're really talking about is inherently political, because the political moment, the westernized political moment, is really this mathematical equation that seems to be how quickly can we handle the Black problem without doing enough to get people mobilized behind a fear that they could be next, right? And so one of the major critiques from within Black LGBTQIA+ communities involved in the Black Lives Matter movement is the invisibility of transgender, queer, and genderqueer Black victims of police brutality, victims of gendered violence within the Black community that's not being addressed, how these bodies are people from our specific community of being Black and LGBTQIA+ just go missing. And there almost seems to be an invisibilizing of that body because no one wants to have the conversation about genderqueer, transgender ways of being, queer ways of being, bisexuality. And so how does your work attend to this current dialogue in which we're trying to disassemble this idea of hierarchical representation when it comes to quantity, but trying to increase the quality of how we're able to collectively speak about the value of our lives without invisibilizing our community as in the way that almost sometimes to me reads as like shame or respectability.
For sure. It's like the only way in which we can mobilize behind a figure if it's like particularly respectable cis heterosexual Black man, right? Like that's the body that's worthy of us, you know, marching, fighting for, etc. I think one of the things that's really interesting is the Infinite Essence series being a response to like police violence, police killings of Black people, but most of the figures in Infinite Essence are queer. And so I think that's an interesting way in which people will respond really like positively to the images, and you know, thinking about like that kind of tension there between how people typically mobilize behind certain figures, while these ones that are responses are primarily queer figures. And one thing that I was actually really thankful for in Jari's work was, you know, the poem that you had, and it is dedication to, I think it was Tracy K. Smith. Was it Tracy?
I have a poem in dedication to Carice Lewis.
Oh,
yeah. But also there is that Tracy K. Smith poem, The Body's Question. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So the Carice, but like, I mean, I think for even like within the community, the like quote unquote invisibility and not even knowing about this particular stories of literally victims of police violence who are queer and trans, even as a queer person.
Right. Right. And to piggyback off of that, like, yeah, there's this poem I have called Involuntary Exits, in dedication of Carice Lewis, who was a masculine of center person, I believe from DC. And, you know, the way that they were murdered was very violent and brutal. But if you look further into their story, you know, they were very much integral and a part of their Black community. And they had friends who were also murdered as well. But, you know, to hear a story about a Carice Lewis, you never get to hear that because folks don't know that a Carice Lewis exists, right? Especially in our communities. When we talk about a national, broader kind of scope of Blackness and how that is represented, how that is portrayed, when we are lifting up names, you know, oftentimes, yes, we, you know, the Black, queer, trans folks of our communities are left off that list. And so in my work, it is very integral for me to uplift those names, specifically because not just as a Black person, I could be next, but as a Black, queer, masculine of center presenting person, I need folks to know that I'm here. I need folks to know that we are here and we always have been, that a lot of these movements could not exist without us via, you know, Alicia Garza and all the other women, Black queer women associated with Black Lives Matter. I mean, Black Lives Matter came out of a love letter that Alicia Garza wrote, right? So we have to always, as Black folks, be in tune with the fact that we are kin, right? And our kin is here and that we exist. And I think, you know, it is so crucial for me to create discourse around, you know, this concentration on Blackness in this country as it exists, as having always been queer in and of itself. Blackness is queer here, period. So Black people, to me, if you're asking me, Black people are a queer people. Now that's controversial depending on who you're talking to, right? There are many people who don't want to be associated with that kind of queerness at all. But Blackness is so expansive that it is many things. It is vast, but it is, you know, here in this context, we have never been, you know, we have never conformed here. So Black people are we don't conform. It's impossible for us to conform or be of conformity here. So we are naturally, well, not naturally, but we have been described and defined in this country as non-conforming beings, right? So for me, you know, as Black folks, we need to have more conversations situated such as this, right? Where we have, you know, our cishet brothers and sisters, our queer and trans brothers and sisters, and folks in between who are having that cross, you know, kind of conversation about, you know, the fact that, you know, none of us really were meant to belong here, right? And that unites us and that ties us in our nonconformity, that there is power there, that there's a level of agency there, there's an opportunity there, right, to resist. And I think really to resist the paradigms and the conditions that cis hetero white supremacist patriarchy has put on us as a collective people, that there is a connection, and that you cannot have freedom and you cannot have a movement without us. It does literally has never and will never exist, a la Bayard Rustin, right? A la all the other Black and queer folks that you never hear about, the Judges, the Pauli Murrays, right? All of those people, Black and queer, you could not have what you have now without us, right? So those are the kinds of discourses and conversations in my work, and also what I see in Mikael's work that are, you know, pushed to the forefront. Yeah.
So thank you so much. So my last question is about this almost trap of like dichotomy and gender, this swinging, tilting plane between the masculine and the feminine, and how even when we are starting to create a discourse and a rhetoric and a language around how we are going to have these necessary conversations within our community for ourselves, we oftentimes have to double back and remind ourselves that we're still talking in the binary. So I want the both of you, as our last question, it just goes so fast and you both are so incredible, to talk about what does your work do to confront that binary? How is the binary still useful or not useful? I know in your poems, Jari, there's a very complicated tango happening between masculinity and femininity. The masculine often presents itself in this violent way, but then the masculine is also confronting a version of itself that is genderqueer, that shows a different possibility, that it's often violently reacting to, almost as if in a panic of violence and not knowing what to do. And Mikael, in your work, when you're talking about Amem, there is this moment where people come to the beauty of your photography, or they come to Limitless Africans, and all of a sudden it's through your formal expertise as a photographer that this question of gender becomes easier to talk about and more openly, easier to be more openly discussed in the presence of your artistic hand. That's where I'm going.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, so that kind of, I loved when you talked about kind of that tilting plane of masculine and feminine, right? Because I think that way of thinking about gendered being is so much more in line actually with African interpretations, right? Of like this vibratory nature of gender, right? Now, of everybody having these different vibrations of masculine and feminine energy, and particularly if you had kind of like a closer like mixture of the two, that you were closer to the divine, right? And so between like both of my series, there's been this there's been like this larger impulse to, I guess, redefine within that larger framework what it means to have like to be a being. you know One of the things that I also was thinking about when you were talking was, I talked about Amma, the androgynous creator god, but also even within the Egyptian context, the Nile River was what had the god Hapi, and Hapi was this intersex, multi-gendered being you can't really determine. And so I think particularly with the Infinite Essence series, with the Limitless African series, there was this play, between like giving the allowing the models the agency to kind of choose their clothing, choose their objects, and adorn themselves in a way that could define for themselves what does their representation look like, right? And within Infinite Essence, there's this way in which the embodied figure almost floats away into this primordial blackness in which notions of gender are in this monolithic state where it's this, again, this androgyny, right? People will look at the figure of a mem and be like, oh, he, she. So I actually don't know if people are more open to the conversation. I'm not sure if that would be. I'm not sure if people are more open. People are still kind of like, oh, what's that? That shows kind of a
At
lot
least
of.
they asked what it was.
Yeah. So yes. So, but I think though, again, going back to that idea of, the figure and the gendered notions of the figure like floating away into this primordial blackness, I feel like that is really kind of, again, in line with these larger historical and mythological narratives that we've always held as Black people.
Yeah. I definitely, I feel like in what I do, I'm always trying to present the contradiction I think that the binary presents, right? And that to highlight that, at any given time, there's fluidity, that the masculine and the feminine are tied and that they exist in us, right? And it's especially examining my own relationship and access to masculinity. There's so much contradiction embedded within that connection, in that presentation, and I've had to confront there in the violences, what I'm saying, that is associated with masculinity, but also like some of the nuances that I think gender queerness presents for masculinity, right? So to offer an alternative kind of mode of masculinity, if you will. But essentially, my goal in my work, I don't know if I always achieve it, but my goal in my work is really to dismantle the binary in and of itself. I think there should be this doing away, with the binary, with having to think, in these categorized ways about who we are, about, our expression, our gendered expression, because, that is very limiting. That has been a means to oppress us, historically, through Judeo-Christian values, but also, we foreclose on our own possibility, around expression. There's so many of us, imagine, if, we let some of our sons, play in dresses, or if we let some of our daughters, what I'm saying, go out and shoot the ball, how many of us, have foreclosed on our own children, right? But essentially, there is, the goal in my work to really emphasize that, that both are true, right? That both can exist, that, you know, the masculine and the feminine can harm, but also can be informative. You know, you have, you know, what most people don't know is that they, you know, we have, you know, hormonally, we have both estrogen and testosterone in our bodies. And depending on which way the pendulum swings, right? If you have a hormonal imbalance, you can have more estrogen or more testosterone in your system, right? So we, you know, there's also this attempt that my work does for us to really get to know our bodies more intuitively, more interiorly, and more specifically to understand, right, that like we literally embody fluidity. We literally have that involved in our makeup, in our being. And so, you know, the work really is about, right, trying to get closer to, you know, the kinds of mishmash of all of that, right? And to find alternative modes of being and find freedom, really, to access a kind of liberation that I think Black queer folks provide, you know. Yeah.
Thank you. And another great reading resource to follow up on what Jari just said about balancing of estrogen and testosterone in the body and the endocrine system, there's a book called The Body Now. You can get it on Amazon, and it is a great text that talks about the workings of just the human body in forms of, you know, like our mucous membrane, our blood, the way that our interstitium, which is like a chemical superhighway right underneath our skin, kind of transfers all of these things backwards and forwards. And it gives you a better understanding, but it also gives you a very short but specific history of how gender was encouraged to be hormonally adjusted in the 50s and the 60s, with certain prescriptions being provided by OB-GYNs, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to make sure that all of the texts that I mentioned are on Facebook for those who want to read more. And I have to give a humongous and totally complete thank you to Jari and Mikael for being here for this conversation, for sharing, for being open, and for doing this emotional and effective labor here with us today. And I want to thank everybody who's listened, and I want to thank everyone who's commented, and I will see you twice in October. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.